Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. We love to really get into a topic, and today is no exception. We're diving into the science of empathy. And you've given us a fantastic excerpt to work with. It focuses on how empathy actually works within our brains and the impact it has on society.
Mhm.
So get ready to unpack not just what empathy is, but also why it matters in your daily life.
It's a fascinating topic for sure, and one that I think we'll find has a huge influence on everything from our personal relationships to even our careers.
Yeah, for sure. I think we often underestimate how much empathy plays a role in those things.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start with something I bet you've thought about before. Have you ever wondered why you find yourself welling up during a sad movie, even though it's not your life falling apart on screen?
That's a great example of empathy in action. The excerpt actually makes a key distinction between two types of empathy, cognitive and emotional.
Two types. Interesting. Okay, tell me more.
So cognitive empathy is about understanding someone's feelings intellectually. Like you can see things from their perspective even if you don't actually feel their emotions yourself.
So if my friend is stressed about a big presentation at work, I can understand why they're feeling that way, even if I'm not personally feeling stressed. You know what I mean?
Exactly. You're not necessarily mirroring their emotions, but you get it. Then there's emotional empathy, which is more about actually feeling those emotions alongside the other person.
Ah, so that explains the waterworks during those heart-wrenching movie scenes. My brain's basically mirroring the character's sadness.
That's a great way to put it. And it leads us to the really cool part, the brain science behind all of this.
Hit me with it, I'm ready.
Well, you've probably heard of mirror neurons before. There are these amazing cells in our brains that fire up when we see someone expressing an emotion, almost as if we were experiencing it ourselves.
Whoa. So our brains are literally mimicking the other person's brain activity. That's crazy.
It's pretty wild, right? And it's not just the mirror neurons at play. The excerpt mentions several other key brain regions that get involved in empathy.
Okay, lay it on me. Give me the grand tour of the empathetic brain.
All right, let's start with the anterior insula, or AI for short. It's the part of your brain responsible for those gut-wrenching feelings you get when you see someone in pain.
So the AI is helping us actually feel what others are feeling, not just understand it intellectually.
Precisely. Now let's move on to the prefrontal cortex, or PFC, the brain's executive suite, so to speak. This is where we try to understand why someone feels the way they do.
So the PFC helps us move beyond just feeling sad with someone and actually piece together the reasons behind their sadness.
Exactly. And then there's the anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC. Imagine it as your brain's social autopilot, helping you navigate the complex world of social interactions and respond appropriately to others' emotions.
So ACC is key for picking up on social cues and figuring out how to react in different situations.
You got it. And of course, we can't forget the amygdala, the brain region known for its role in processing emotions, especially fear. When it comes to empathy, the amygdala helps you quickly recognize emotional expressions in others, like a fearful face or a tense voice.
Wow, so there's a whole symphony of brain activity happening when we experience empathy.
Absolutely. And to make it even more intricate, there are some chemical messengers involved too, hormones like oxytocin and dopamine.
Okay, now we're talking brain chemicals. Tell me more.
Well, oxytocin is often called the love hormone because it plays a big role in social bonding and attachment. And guess what? When you feel empathy for someone, your brain releases oxytocin, strengthening your connection with them.
So empathy is literally chemically bonding us to other people. That's incredible. What about dopamine?
Dopamine is all about pleasure and reward. You know that warm, fuzzy feeling you get when you do something nice for someone?
Yeah.
That's dopamine at work.
So our brains are wired to reward us for being kind and empathetic. That makes a lot of sense.
It does. It's like a positive feedback loop, encouraging us to continue those pro-social behaviors.
This is all so fascinating. But how does all this brain stuff actually play out in our everyday lives? I mean, what's the point of all this empathy anyway?
That's the thing. It's not just some abstract brain process. Empathy has a huge impact on how you navigate your life, your relationships, even your career.
Okay, I'm all ears. How does it actually shape our behavior and interactions?
Well, for starters, empathy is a core component of what we call emotional intelligence, or EI.
EI. That rings a bell.
Yeah.
Isn't that about being aware of and managing your own emotions and understanding the emotions of others as well?
That's it. And empathy is a big part of it. People with high EI are better at reading social cues, understanding other people's perspectives, and building strong relationships. It's a valuable skill in any field, really, but especially in leadership roles, teamwork, and any situation where you're interacting with other people.
So empathy isn't just about being nice. It's a key ingredient for success in life.
I'd say so. And it goes beyond just personal success. Empathy is also what drives something called pro-social behavior.
Prosocial behavior, what is that exactly?
It's basically any action that's intended to help others. Think volunteering, donating to charity, or even just offering a helping hand to someone in need.
So those warm, fuzzy feelings of empathy aren't just staying inside our heads. They're actually motivating us to make a positive difference in the world.
Exactly. Think about it. If you see someone struggling and you can empathize with their situation, you're much more likely to step up and help than if you just brushed it off.
It makes total sense.
Oh.
But I have to admit, I've heard people talk about the downsides of having too much empathy. Like, isn't it possible to get burnt out from feeling everyone else's pain all the time?
That's a really important point. And it highlights the complexity of empathy. The excerpt you provided actually mentioned two potential pitfalls when it comes to empathy.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about these pitfalls.
So those pitfalls of empathy. You were intrigued.
Oh yeah, lay it on me. What are we talking about here?
Well, one is something called empathy deficit. And it's often linked to certain personality disorders where individuals have a really hard time understanding and responding to the emotions of others.
That makes sense. When you think about it, empathy is kind of the glue that holds our social interactions together. So if someone is lacking that ability, it can lead to some serious challenges in their relationships.
Right. And then there's the flip side. Too much empathy can actually be a problem too.
You mean like those people who get so overwhelmed by other people's emotions that they practically shut down?
That's one example. The excerpt uses the term empathic distress to describe this. It's that feeling of being completely swamped by other people's suffering to the point where it takes a toll on your own well-being.
I've definitely felt that before, especially when I'm watching the news or reading stories about people going through really tough times. It can be hard to shake off that feeling of sadness or helplessness.
It's completely understandable, and it highlights the importance of finding that balance between caring for others and caring for ourselves. We need to develop strategies for managing those intense emotions so we don't end up getting burned out.
So it's not selfish to set boundaries and prioritize our own mental health.
Not at all. It's essential. If we're constantly depleted and overwhelmed, we won't be able to effectively help anyone. Remember that classic analogy about putting on your own oxygen mask on an airplane before assisting others? It's the same principle with empathy.
That's a great reminder.
Yeah.
But going back to empathy itself, I'm curious, where did this whole empathy thing come from in the first place? It's not like our ancient ancestors were sitting around having deep conversations about their feelings.
Right, that's a fascinating question. It takes us into the realm of evolutionary psychology. The idea is that empathy developed as a survival mechanism for our early human ancestors.
A survival mechanism.
Okay, I'm listening.
Think about it. Early humans lived in small, tight-knit groups. Their survival depended on cooperation and mutual support. Those who were better at understanding and responding to each other's needs were more likely to thrive.
So basically, if you were a jerk who didn't care about your fellow tribe members, you were less likely to make it. Exactly. And over time, those empathetic traits became hardwired into our brains. It's amazing to think that empathy isn't just some nice-to-have quality. It's literally woven into our DNA.
Wow, that's incredible. It makes you realize how deeply rooted empathy is in our biology and why it plays such a fundamental role in human social behavior. But here's another thought. We've been talking about empathy as if it's a universal human trait. Is it really the same across all cultures?
That's a sharp observation. While the capacity for empathy is certainly innate, how it's expressed and valued can vary quite a bit across cultures.
So even though we all have the same basic brain wiring for empathy, our upbringing and our cultural norms can shape how we experience and express it?
Precisely. Think about it. Some cultures emphasize individualism and self-reliance, while others prioritize collectivism and interdependence. These cultural norms can influence how people perceive and respond to the emotions of others.
That's interesting. So in a culture that values stoicism and emotional restraint, people might be less likely to openly express empathy, even if they're feeling it internally.
Exactly. And conversely, in a culture that emphasizes communal harmony and emotional expressiveness, people might be much more outwardly demonstrative with their empathy.
So there's no one-size-fits-all approach to empathy. It's all about understanding the cultural context. Which leads me to another question. Can empathy be learned or strengthened? Is it something we're stuck with, or can we actually cultivate more of it?
That's a question a lot of people ask, especially given how crucial empathy is for personal and societal well-being. And the good news is, there's a growing body of research on empathy training programs and interventions.
Okay, tell me more. What are some of the techniques they use in these programs?
Well, one common approach is mindfulness meditation. By practicing mindfulness, you can learn to become more aware of your own emotions and the emotions of others without judgment or reactivity.
So it's about quieting that mental chatter and really tuning in to what's happening both inside ourselves and in the people around us.
Exactly. Another technique is perspective-taking exercises, where people are encouraged to imagine themselves in someone else's shoes and consider their thoughts, their feelings, their motivations.
That sounds like a great way to challenge our own biases and assumptions.
Mm.
What else?
Some programs use storytelling art music to evoke empathy and foster emotional connection. It's not just about sitting in a classroom and listening to lectures, it's about engaging your emotions and imagination in creative ways.
So we're not just talking about some feel-good self-help stuff.
Yeah,
There's actual scientific evidence that we can train our brains to be more empathetic.
that's right. And this has huge implications for so many areas of life. Education, healthcare, conflict resolution, and pretty much every other aspect of human interaction.
This is mind-blowing. It
Yeah.
seems like the more we learn about empathy, the more amazing it becomes. But I have to ask, are there ever times when empathy can be, well, maybe not such a good thing?
You've hit on a really important point. While empathy has so many benefits, there are definitely times when it can be exploited or even manipulated.
Hold on, are we talking about like those energy vampires who drain you emotionally? Or those con artists who prey on people's good intentions?
You could say that. But yes, there are certainly individuals and even systems that can take advantage of our empathetic tendencies for their own gain.
Okay, now you've got me really curious. How does this manipulation of empathy work?
Well, think about advertising, for example. Many marketing campaigns appeal to our emotions. Maybe they're tugging at our heartstrings with images of people in need or triggering our fears with statistics about certain risks.
So they're using our empathy to sell us products or ideas.
Exactly. And it's not just advertising. Politicians often use emotional appeals to rally support for their policies, whether it's invoking fear of an enemy or promising hope for a better future.
So empathy can be a powerful tool for persuasion,
Mm.
both for good and for bad. That's something I'll have to keep in mind.
For sure. And it's up to us as discerning individuals to be aware of these tactics and make conscious choices about how we respond to them. We need to be able to feel empathy without being naive or letting our emotions completely cloud our judgment.
That's a good point. It seems like empathy is kind of a double-edged sword.
Hmm.
It can be used to connect us and inspire compassion, but it can also be used to manipulate and exploit us.
It's the paradox of empathy, and it highlights the importance of critical thinking and emotional intelligence. We need to find that sweet spot between being open-hearted and clear-headed.
So it's about finding that balance between feeling with our hearts and thinking with our heads.
Exactly, and that balance is something we can all strive for in our own lives. This has been a really enlightening conversation. We've gone from the evolutionary roots of empathy to cultural variations and even touched on the potential for manipulation.
It's been quite a journey, but we're not finished yet. In part 3, we'll explore some of the ethical dilemmas surrounding empathy and dive into the fascinating intersection of empathy technology and the future of human connection. Sounds like we're in for another mind-expanding adventure. Stay tuned. And we're back for the final part of our empathy deep dive. You know, after all that talk about how empathy works and even how it evolved, my brain is kind of buzzing. Now we're getting into the ethics of empathy. Color me intrigued.
It really is fascinating, isn't it, how this one concept leads to such a web of questions.
Mhm.
And in this last part, we're going to explore some of those trickier areas.
Okay, bring on the ethical dilemmas. What kind of quandaries are we talking about here?
Well, one of the biggest challenges with empathy is figuring out who we choose to empathize with. We all have a limited capacity for empathy, right? And we're constantly bombarded with information about people struggling all over the world.
Yeah, it's impossible to empathize with everyone who's going through a hard time. I get that.
Yeah.
But it also feels kind of, well, uncomfortable.
It's not about feeling bad, though. It's about recognizing that we have to make choices about where we direct our empathy. And those choices can be tough.
I see the dilemma. So how do we navigate these choices? How do we decide who deserves our empathy?
There's no easy answer. But one helpful principle is to think about the vulnerability of the people involved. Who's most in need of compassion and support? Whose voices are being silenced or marginalized?
So it's about prioritizing those who are most at risk or who are facing systemic disadvantages.
Exactly. And here's another ethical piece to consider, something called empathy bias. We naturally tend to empathize more easily with people who are similar to us, people who share our values, beliefs, or experiences.
I can definitely see that. It's easier to relate to someone who sees the world the way I do.
Right. And while that's natural, it's important to be aware of this bias and make an effort to extend our empathy to people who are different from us.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
After all, empathy is supposed to bridge divides, not reinforce them. But I gotta admit, sometimes it feels like the world is just overflowing with suffering. It can be overwhelming. How do we avoid getting burnt out by all the negativity?
That's a valid concern, and it goes back to what we touched on earlier, empathic distress. It's so important to find that healthy balance between caring for others and caring for ourselves.
So it's not selfish to set boundaries and prioritize our own well-being?
Not at all. It's essential. If we're constantly depleted and overwhelmed, we won't be able to help anyone effectively. Remember that classic analogy, putting on your own oxygen mask on an airplane before assisting others. It's the same principle with empathy.
That's a great way to think about it.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about choosing where to focus our empathy and avoiding burnout. Any other ethical challenges we should consider?
Well, there's another interesting question about empathy's role in our justice system. Should legal decisions be based on empathy and compassion, or should they be purely objective and impartial?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I can see strong arguments on both sides.
Definitely. Some people believe that empathy could lead to biased judgments. They argue that justice should be blind to personal feelings and focus solely on the facts.
So emotions should be left out of the courtroom.
That's one perspective. However, there are others who believe that empathy is essential for truly understanding the context of a crime and the motivations of the people involved. They believe that a justice system without empathy can be too harsh and ultimately ineffective.
It seems like a delicate balancing act between upholding the law and acknowledging the human side of things.
You nailed it. And it's an ongoing discussion in society. But shifting gears a bit, there's one final area I'm really curious to explore with you. Empathy in our increasingly digital world. Does empathy even have a place in a world dominated by technology?
That's a great question. It seems like technology is both connecting and isolating us at the same time.
It's definitely a double-edged sword. On the one hand, technology can connect us to people all over the world and expose us to diverse perspectives and experiences.
It's true. Social media, for example, allows us to connect with people from all walks of life.
Right, and that can be a great way to cultivate empathy and understanding. But then there's the potential downside. Spending too much time online can actually lead to social isolation and a decline in those crucial face-to-face interactions.
And without those real-world connections, our ability to empathize might actually weaken.
Precisely. Plus, there's the issue of online disinhibition, the tendency for people to feel less restrained online and more likely to engage in aggressive or hurtful behavior.
Ah, yes, the internet trolls. It's definitely easier to be nasty to someone when you're hiding behind a screen.
Unfortunately, that's true. And it can create this toxic online environment where empathy is hard to find.
So it seems like technology can either enhance or hinder our empathy depending on how we use it.
Exactly. Which is why it's crucial to be mindful of our technology use and make conscious choices about how we engage online.
I'm noticing a theme here. Mindfulness, balance, conscious choices.
Oh.
They seem to be the key ingredients for navigating all the complexities of empathy, both in our personal lives and in the world around us.
You're absolutely right. Empathy isn't a passive trait. It's an active practice that requires awareness, effort, and a willingness to challenge our own biases.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. We've explored so many different facets of empathy, the science, the psychology, the ethical considerations, even the impact of technology. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of this amazing human capacity.
It's been my pleasure exploring all this with you. As we wrap up our deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought. We've talked about the importance of empathy for ourselves, for others, for society as a whole. But what about empathy for the planet?
Wow, that's a profound question. Can we even empathize with nature?
That's the challenge and the opportunity.
Yeah.
Can we expand our circle of compassion to include the natural world, the animals, the plants, the ecosystems that sustain us all? I'll leave you with that to ponder as we sign off today.
That's an incredible invitation to broaden our understanding of empathy. Thank you for guiding us through this deep dive. It's given me so much to think about. And to all of you listening out there, keep exploring and keep those empathetic vibes flowing. We'll see you next time for another
You've
deep
been
dive.
listening to the Learning Podcast, a production of Metanesta. Remember, learning is a journey. One step, one insight, one skill at a time. We'll see you next time. Keep learning, stay curious, and as always, be awesome.